William Bain is a professor of political science. In fact, just told me yesterday that he, on this trip, heard that he had been promoted to professor. So professor of political science at the National University of Singapore. He has previously taught at Glasgow University and Aberystwyth University in Wales, and as a visiting professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. He is actively engaged in research and teaching in the areas of international relations, international political theory, and the history of ideas, and he's particularly interested in the place of religion in the theory and practice of international relations. He's the author of numerous publications, also had a number of editorial assignments. Currently, he is the co-editor of the journal International Relations. We've asked him here today to talk about his recent book, Political Theology of International Order, which was published last year by Oxford University Press. We're very grateful that he could join us and are happy to welcome him to BYU and to the Kennedy Center. So, Professor Bain.
Thanks, Dan, for that very warm welcome. I want to begin by saying I'm just positively delighted to be here at the Kennedy Center today, not least because this is the first time I've been out of Singapore in some 270-odd days. But also, I want to say thank you to the very warm welcome that I've received from the colleagues who I've met with last night, and also the students that I've had the opportunity to engage with. We don't have a great deal of time, so I'd like to get right into things. And by way of beginning, I want to say that the overarching objective of political theology of international order is to uncover presuppositions of international order that originate in medieval theology. Now, this runs counter to the prevailing narrative of international relations, which describes the contrast between medieval and modern as being categorically different epochs. The transition from one to the other, so we're told, heralded the secularization of international life. With this transition, talk of God was gradually drained away, leaving a secular domain that could be explained entirely on its own terms. Now, the Peace of Westphalia is a very important part of this narrative. Westphalia, again, so we are told, inaugurated the modern state system by consolidating state sovereignty and its corollary, the principle of non-intervention. In the book, I challenged this narrative by arguing that theological ideas didn't simply fall away once God had been banished from the cathedral of modern international thought, but rather these theological ideas are still productive in an important way, in the sense that these ideas shape not only the questions we ask about international relations, but also the way in which we answer them. I argue further that familiar ways of thinking about international order are correctly interpreted as a worldly application of a theological pattern. Now, before proceeding any further, I want to issue 3 disclaimers, the first of which relates to the idea of political theology itself. Political theology is a big topic. It reveals different understandings. And I understand, or I approach political theology in the book as an approach that entails analyzing politics, such as institutional arrangements, sources of authority, justifications and purposes of rule, in the context of theological concepts and categories. Now, this leads me to my second disclaimer, and that is to say that the book is not itself a work of theology. The argument is historical and philosophical orientation, and it's geared or aimed at making the point that the idea of international order has a history that includes theological antecedents. Therefore, I don't in the book assert that revelation is the proper ground of international relations. The third disclaimer is that today I don't propose to provide a synopsis of the book, not least of which we simply don't have the time to do that in 40-odd minutes. And in any case, I find that attempts to provide a synopsis of a book in the end isn't very interesting. So what I want to do instead is to sketch out some important themes, or at least themes that I take to be important. And these include the idea of rival conceptions of order. The book is very much built around this idea of rival conceptions of order that arise out of medieval theology. I also want to illustrate how these theological ideas that I examine structure thinking about international order and contemporary international thought. And thirdly, I want to illustrate a tension that arises out of this theological inheritance. So with those disclaimers laid out, let me now move on to address this idea of rival conceptions of order. And my point of departure here is a 13th century theological dispute about the nature of God and the extent of his power. And this dispute yielded rival conceptions of order, which I argue are still present in our contemporary political thought. One of these theories, the theory of imminent order, is a synthesis of Greek philosophy and Christian revelation. Now, Plato is a central figure here, although it's not the Plato of the text that comes first in the canon of Western political thought, but rather it's the Plato of the dialogue, Timaeus. Timaeus explains the order of the cosmos as the work of the demiurge who brings together pre-existing matter and pre-existing form, pre-existing being the key word here. The visible world is therefore framed in terms of eternal forms that dictate a rationally intelligible pattern of place and purpose in which individual things contribute to the perfection of the whole. Consequently, the cosmos and the order that it discloses necessarily is what it is. There are no second or companion worlds. As Timaeus explains to Socrates in the dialogue, quote, "There must be one only if the created copy is to accord with the original." Now, the problem, of course, from a Christian perspective, is that this Timaeus story contradicts what is written in Genesis, which begins, as we all know, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. The God of Genesis is no mere craftsman who makes by arranging what already exists, but God instead is a creator, properly so called. He created the universe out of nothing. But the cosmos-making story of Timaeus was close enough to the creation story of Genesis that it facilitated a rapprochement, if you will, between Greek philosophy and Christian revelation. However, it wasn't Christians in the first instance that made the critical move, but rather Hellenized Jews, Philo of Alexandria foremost among them, aligned the creation story of Genesis with the cosmos-making story of Timaeus in such a way that the creative act was explained by analogy with an architect. Just as an architect has a plan before commencing construction of a city, God also had a plan as he created the universe. Now, the general outlines of Philo's position is present in St. Augustine's decisive synthesis between the Neoplatonic God of Athens and the biblical God of Jerusalem. Augustine retains the idea that God created the universe according to a rational plan. However, the forms that guide the work of Plato's demiurge is located in the divine intellect. As Augustine explains, quote, they, referring to the forms, must be thought to exist nowhere but in the very mind of the Creator. Now, a distinctive conception of order corresponds with this understanding of God. The order of the universe is, on this view, is understood as an interconnected whole in which individual things jointly compose a necessary pattern of right order. Moreover, this pattern is luminous to reason, and it's explained with reference to both efficient and final causes, that is, in terms of existence and purpose. It's in terms of these intellectual commitments that Augustine says that the tranquility of order consists in, quote, the disposition of equal and unequal things in such a way as to give to each its proper place. Again, this proper place gets at this idea of a necessary pattern of order. We can contrast this understanding of order with the theory of imposed order. This theory reflects an attempt to vindicate God's freedom as against the metaphysical snares of Greek philosophy. Simply put, some theologians were concerned that the rational nature of creation might qualify God's freedom. In other words, the problem was, or the question was, is God subject and constrained by the rationality of the universe that he created? So-called nominalist theologians responded to this problem by prioritizing the biblical conception of God, a God of power and might, when interpreting the creation story. According to this interpretation, God speaks the universe into existence by sheer force of will and the efficient causality of the words, "let it be." But vindicating God's unfettered freedom in this way came at a cost. And the cost was that it destroyed the rational plan that guided the creative act in Augustine's account and Philo's account. As a result, all things visible and invisible, all logical entities, all propositions of truth, and indeed all possibility and impossibility are at this point simply mandates of the divine will. Again, a distinctive conception of order corresponds with this understanding of God. It leads to a radically contingent conception of order that's composed of individual things that have no inherent connection with any other thing, such that everything is a thing considered in itself. Order, to the extent that it exists at all, is imposed from without and is expressed in terms of a system of external relations. And knowledge of this pattern is acquired by empirical observation, the investigation of efficient causes, and observing the behavior of things. Now, I realize I've covered a lot of ground at this point, and a lot of this ground is quite abstract. So allow me to give you an analogy, as it were, to illustrate what I'm getting at, and that is the Lego analogy. I suspect that everybody here is familiar with the children's toy Lego, and I'd be one to confess that it's not a children's toy. I still enjoy Lego at this point. But again, everybody's familiar with the Lego story. So you go buy a Lego kit, say it's one of those really big Star Wars spaceships sort of things, which I tend to like, and you get it home and you get it around to the kitchen table, and you open the box, and it's got all these packets, and you open them, and you dump it all on the table, and you've got a big heap of bricks there. And as a heap of bricks, they're all disordered. But fortunately for us, the handy engineers at Lego provide that booklet of diagrams that explains how each of those bricks in that kit come together to form a spaceship. And the point is that every one of those bricks has a place and a purpose, and they contribute to the whole, namely the completed spaceship. We know with children in particular, though, that after you put it together and you play with it for a while, kids kind of get bored with stuff. And so what do kids do? They're going to take the spaceship apart to make something else, right? They might want to make a different spaceship, or maybe an airplane, or a barn, or something else. And it's at this point that the booklet of diagrams is no longer of any use. It can be thrown in the bin. You don't need it. The bricks can go together in any way that you wish, right? Those bricks no longer have a necessary place or purpose, right? They can be made and unmade to make all sorts of different things, the only limit of which is the imagination of the child. Now, going back to the analogy, the first example I gave, putting the bricks together according to the diagrams, whereby each brick contributes to the whole, that's the theory of imminent order, right? Again, every brick has a place and a purpose. And if you have a leftover brick, or one that doesn't quite fit, that's contingency or disorder, right? You've made a mistake, okay? The bricks come together in one way only. The second example is the theory of imposed order. Those bricks can come together any way you want. You could take half of them and make one thing, and the other half and make something else. Again, everything can be made and unmade. That's the theory of imposed order. Now, both of these theories, I argue, are present in contemporary international thought. They were assimilated into modern thought with the help of recurring analogies between divine and human. As with God, so too popes, emperors, and kings. Now, the immediate implication here is that this puts the transition from medieval to modern in a rather different light. Modern theories of order, of international order, I want to argue, and here I'm paraphrasing a really excellent book by Michael Allen Gillespie, The Theological Origins of Modernity, that these modern theories of international order are not constructed on a new plot and entirely out of new building materials, but rather they're constructed out of the rubble of the Middle Ages. These theories are not equally prominent or significant, however. Imposed order, in the modern context, is the dominant discourse. International order is, by and large, in IR theory, understood as a contingent arrangement. It's something that is made and unmade. However, the discourse of imminent order survives as a rhetoric. It's invoked to stabilize the contingency of a constructed world. In other words, imminent order serves as something like the halter and bit of unfettered freedom. It limits what can be done in the name of will and artifice. Crucially, and this is a really important point, I've laid out two rival conceptions of order, but these theories represent incommensurable positions. They're distinct modes of understanding and explanation, and they cannot be combined to form a composite account of order. Indeed, I think that one of the sources of abiding tension in modern international thought stems at least in part from mistaken attempts to combine these two understandings of order. So, having laid out these rival conceptions of order, well, how do they play out in IR theory or international relations, right? So it's to that question I want to move now. The idea of a system of states, in a generic sense, refers to a complex whole that's formed by the interaction of its constitutive parts. And the core problem of such a system is reconciling the demands of freedom with the requirements of order. Now, importantly, this problem parallels the theological problem of reconciling God's freedom with the regular order of nature. Now, at this point, it's important to recall the basic coordinates or postulates of the theory of imposed order. The language here is that order or reality is composed of singular things that have no connection with any other thing, and that these things disclose a pattern of order in terms of a system of external relations that are imposed from without. And this pattern is explained with reference to efficient causes. Now, when we translate this language of imposed order into the language of international relations, we encounter something quite familiar. Independent states in a condition of anarchy. No intrinsic or inherent connections to any other. A system of relations that are imposed from, or rather, relations constituted by the balance of power or rules of law, in both cases imposed from without. And finally, whatever pattern of order there is, it's explained by empirical observation. That is, observing what states do, observing state behavior. Now, this parallel can be drawn out further by considering Samuel Clarke's defense of God's freedom in his famous exchange with Leibniz. God, Clarke insists, does not create and then retire from the scene, having set the machine of the universe into motion, but rather God actively upholds and governs the order of the universe. Now, here we need to notice that there's a very important difference between human beings and God. Human beings compose independently of the forces that govern what is made. So what am I getting at here? Well, Sir Isaac Newton's natural philosophy illustrates what I'm getting at. Newton tells us that he can explain the motion of the heavenly bodies with reference to the law of gravity. However, he goes on to say, in providing this explanation, that it is unnecessary to provide an account of gravity. In other words, he says that we don't need to assign a cause to gravity in order to explain the motion of the heavenly bodies. It is enough, he says, to know the effect that gravity produces. Now, this contrasts quite sharply when we consider God and the activity of creation or creating. God composes not merely within an order of secondary causes. He is both author and preserver of the forces or the powers that move what he makes. Now, let me now move on to sort of extend this into an IR context by considering Kenneth Waltz's structural realism. Waltz also, composes a theory without assigning a cause to its moving force. We all know, or at least anybody who's taken Intro to International Relations at some point will know that according to Waltz, the structure of the state system consists in an order of secondary causes that shapes and shoves the behavior of states. And this explains certain law-like regularities in international relations, such as the persistence of war or recurring balances of power. Acquiring knowledge of these regularities, again, does not depend on an account of the force that moves the system. Like Newton, it's enough to know that this force causes certain effects. But what I've said thus far, though, in this, there is concealed in it a theological move that sustains the coherence of the theory. Waltz composes a theory that explains, again, these certain regularities of IR. But in order to set the system in motion, he stipulates and upholds the force that moves the system. In other words, he stipulates that states act to ensure their survival. It's at this point the theorist, Waltz in this case, takes on the role of God to complete the theory. not as an artificer who composes within an order of secondary causes, but as a creator or first cause who wills the force that governs the system. In other words, Waltz establishes a conceptual order and it endures so long as he sees fit. That is, so long as it's deemed to be useful, just as God, the author of nature, condescends to uphold laws that ground the regular order of nature at his pleasure, so long as it pleases him to do so. One implication to come out of this is that the idea of anarchy, arguably kind of the cardinal concept of modern IR theory, is normative in a way that's rarely noticed. The problem with anarchy is not merely one of latent violence in the absence of overarching authority, but rather the point I'm making here is that anarchy is fundamentally about the freedom of states to make and unmake their world. What I'm getting at here then is that anarchy is an expression of a broader philosophical tradition in Western political thought. Freedom and insecurity go hand in hand, as we often recognize in IR theory, in the sense that they are mediated by will and artifice. But this is not an analytically neutral proposition or an innocuous assumption of some sort. It is rather an achievement of thought that is born of a particular time and a particular place. So then let's move on to consider the dilemma, right? So I've illustrated now in one example of how these theological ideas underpin and structure how we think about certain aspects of international relations and the broader idea of order. But there's a dilemma in all of this. As I've already said, the theory of imposed order is the dominant discourse. Its preoccupation, however, with the idea of freedom raises a searching question. In a purely constructed world, a world that is nothing but will and artifice, can anything be truly universal? It's here that the discourse of imminent order survives as a rhetoric in response to this question. Imminent order is invoked to limit what can be done in the name of will and artifice. And it's at this point that we encounter a problem. That problem is that there comes a point when this theological inheritance begins to unravel. It begins to unravel because IR theorists no longer appeal to God to guarantee the regularity of order, at least most IR theorists. Therefore, it's necessary to find a substitute to alleviate the anxiety of uncertainty. Now, Michael Barnett's account of humanitarianism illustrates or provides an example of what I'm getting at here. The discourse of humanity, he says, points to something greater than us. And in doing so, it imparts a transcendent character that fixes the contingency of a constructed world. Significantly, though, when Barnett begins to provide an account of the authority of humanity, he says, very interestingly for me at least, that it is impossible to study humanitarianism apart from religious discourse. In fact, he says, and I quote, "Humanitarianism begins and ends with faith. It sustains and is sustained by faith." Now, the structure of this argument or this description that Barnett gives is meant to perform the work of imminent order, but it tracks the theory of imposed order and the commitments of nominalist theology. In short, the idea of humanity in this context has no intrinsic reason. Its authority is supported simply by an assertion of will, just as the God of nominalist theology mandated physical and moral laws of nature. And it's at this point that we encounter what I like to describe as the indeterminacy of contemporary international order. Again, that core problem. Reconciling the demands of freedom with the requirements of order can be grounded in more than one postulate. Common humanity can be asserted in place of God, or rational autonomy, or human dignity, or environmental stewardship, or some other postulate. Yet this ground is no more secure than before. Why? When human decision takes the place of God, arbitrariness is an inescapable feature of a world that is nothing more than a human construction. Indeed, there's no definitive way of resolving disagreement or conflict between different postulates. This is so because the cognitive status of rational investigation is no more different than belief in God. As Leo Strauss once put it, quote, philosophy, the quest for evident and necessary knowledge, rests itself on an unevident decision, on an act of will, just as faith does. For me, one of the very important implications to come out of this is that it decenters the pervasive belief-unbelief binary that structures so much of political thought. That binary distinguishes the credulous believer who, mired in ignorance, intolerance, and violence, takes refuge in unverifiable, invisible powers when true causes elude their grasp. Of course, the other side of this binary is the so-called incredulous unbeliever who, wedded to rational knowledge, is an agent of progress and liberality and rational political organization. If I'm right in this argument, then this binary, in very important ways, I think, collapses. The implication, then, is that modern secularism evinces its own credulity, not unlike that of the believer. Therefore, unverifiable belief is not the exclusive preserve of those who have, as Immanuel Kant once suggested, who have not yet summoned the courage to know for themselves. So where does this lead then? Well, very briefly, I'd like to gesture in three directions and then wrap it up, because I'm keen to take some questions. The first is that uncovering this theological inheritance has the effect of demythologizing the field of international relations. And in doing so, we understand ourselves better than we do. This I take to be a critical first step in globalizing the study of international relations. Now, one of the sort of very prominent directions or pushes in the study of international relations is the idea of decolonization, right? Is getting away from a Western or Eurocentric understanding of the field. And I'm quite sympathetic to that in many different ways. But what I'm arguing here is that in order to decolonize and to look beyond established and accepted ways of thinking, we need to know the subject that needs to be decolonized in the first place. I mean, in other words, what I'm getting at is I think that if we look at the field of international relations, it suffers from a lack of self-awareness. The idea of the source of its cardinal ideas, its vocabulary, and so forth. The second direction is more focused, and that is that modern theories of international order are not secular in the way that they're normally imagined to be. And that is to say that theological ideas continue to exert considerable influence on modern international thought. This also, for me, is quite important, because if you go back to that master narrative of international relations, it is based in one way or another on this story that begins with a religious Middle Ages that eventually collapses, and then there's a gradual ascent to a secular world. I'm suggesting that in important ways that narrative is mistaken, and that we need to go back and rethink about this sort of theological ground, this theological inheritance that, again, I think shapes not only the questions that we ask about international relations, but crucially structures the way in which we answer them. And the third direction is to suggest that a Christian culture shapes Western theories of international order to a much greater extent than many IR theorists realize. And this has very important implications for a world that is no longer predominantly Western or Christian. And here I'm sort of channeling the fact that I live in Asia, where you have a very different sort of mental universe about what counts, how you engage and interpret the world. So I think that that's also very important, that we need to, again, excavate, the sort of the inheritance, the origins of how we think about the subject, how we think about our world, and how it is theorized. I think I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'd love to take some questions. Please come up to the microphone here. We can also hear your question. Just tell us, tell Professor Bain your name, what you're studying, so we can get to know you a little bit. Please.
Hi, I'm Ruth Hardy. I'm studying American Studies. And I was just curious, you talked about this process of decolonizing, like the language surrounding international relations. And I just wonder, do you think it is possible to fully decolonize international relations, given that many of the powers that kind of dictate and drive them are so integrated in kind of this Christian tradition?
Oh, okay. So let's begin with the idea of decolonizing, right? This is something that's really become very, very prominent in recent years, and for good reason, right? If you engage the world on a global perspective, it is problematic to interpret everything in the world through the lenses of European or Western experience. And an important thrust of this movement is the importance of engaging non-Western thinkers, non-Western modes of thought. For example, indigenous thought, for example. And again, I'm very sympathetic to this. Living in Asia as long as I have, I think this is very important, right? I've begun to dabble and learn Chinese philosophy and sort of and I come to appreciate that there are very different ways of thinking about the world. And I don't mean kind of practical or policy implications, but the basic assumptions about the world are very different. And I think that's very important. But the push coming out of this, or a part of this, is that, well, we've got to engage non-Western thought to decenter the Western subject. And I guess the point that I want to make is that we've got to understand the Western subject that's to be decentered better than we do, right? Because what we often go around saying, well, we live in this secular world, right? Religion is no longer an important part of international relations. And I guess I want to challenge that and say, well, that's not the case. So that's the first step for me. Now, the second step, to respond to your question, well, can we ever fully decolonize? Well, I don't know, to be perfectly honest with you, and I'm afraid that's going to be an unsatisfactory or unsatisfying answer to you. But then, having said that, I'm not sure what exactly it would mean to fully decolonize, right? Learning, education is a continuous process, okay? I don't think it will ever reach a point at which it stops and that we have the answer, right? So it's a continual process that once we decolonize in one move or one direction, well, that itself may raise new questions that need to be addressed. So I guess as I'm thinking out loud here, I wouldn't say that we would ever fully decolonize in the sense that we can close the book and say, right, let's move on to something else, right? I think this is an ongoing process. I mean, I think that's the sort of the essence of learning.
Hi, my name's Lincoln. I was just wondering what pulled you into this field of study? Like what made it really interesting to you when you first started out?
Okay, that's a really good question. And I think for those of you who were there yesterday, I hope you'll pardon me for kind of going over this ground. So like most students of international relations, I was raised on the narrative, right? You know, this progressive story of secularization. And an important part of that story is this contrast between medieval and modern. In fact, a central theme of the book is to knock down the sharp break thesis or sharp contrast between medieval and modern, because we're all told that the Middle Ages, medieval, right, backward, cruel, and so forth. As I like to tell my students, being described as medieval is, on balance, not a good thing, right? It's generally not a compliment. Well, by certain coincidences, accidents, and so forth, I began to read medieval political thought. And I had one of these sort of conversions on the road to Damascus, if you will, realizing that my understanding, this popular pejorative understanding of the Middle Ages, was just totally wrong, right? The Middle Ages was not at all this sort of story of backward. I mean, consider, for example, parliaments, contract theory of government, the idea of natural rights, indeed the idea of a university. These are medieval ideas, a medieval contribution. So that's where I started, as I realized that this story or characterization of the Middle Ages that I had been taught was wrong. It wasn't any sort of brilliant insight on my part. I just started reading historians of medieval political thought. But the other really interesting thing I noticed in doing this and reading this material is that many historians of medieval political thought operate with a very different historical periodization than we do in, say, politics and international relations, the standard ancient, medieval, and modern. A lot of historians of medieval political thought treat the 13th century to the 18th century as a continuous period of experience, and that the Reformation and the Italian Renaissance are not as significant as they're made out to be in other contexts. And so I began to wonder, what would international relations look like if I took this historical periodization, the historical periodization of the historians of medieval political thought, seriously? So that's how I got into it. Mm-hmm. And then you continue to read and read and read. One of the dangers of all of this, or one of the challenges, was that the Middle Ages is an immense period of history. It's enormously fascinating, and every time that I thought, well, okay, I'm sort of, I'm at the top of the mountain, I realized that I was just at a ridge and there's another much bigger mountain behind it. So it took me a very long time to sort of get my head around one small slice of all of this. But that's how I got into it. And then from there, it was a matter of rereading sort of the standard story of international relations, through this different historical periodization, through these theological lenses. So, for example, in the book, I have chapters on Grotius, for example, and I present a very, very different Hobbes than you would typically get in Intro to IR sort of thing. So,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Broderick. I'm studying applied math with a concentration in political science. In your lecture, you talked in depth about how Western international relation theory is influenced by different creation narratives. I was wondering if you could briefly share some insights how perhaps Eastern religious traditions affect their international relation lens.
Okay, this is a really good question, and I don't have a very good answer for you. The reason why is it took me 10 years to write this book, and it's only been out for a year and a half. But one of the reasons I finished on this globalizing IR theme is that in the course of my studies, to realize, at least in the first instance, that there are very interesting parallel debates in Islam, for example. In fact, you get similar debates in Islam much earlier than you get in Christian thought. And so there's quite clearly a lot of work to be done in the Islamic context. Now, I mentioned the 13th century, and an important part of this story, this theological dispute that I made reference to, which sort of birthed these rival theories of order. Well, an important part of that dispute was not just the recovery of the full corpus of Aristotelian thought, but an important part of that dispute is that material came by way of Islamic thinkers. And this was seen by some theologians as a challenge to Christianity. So again, I can't give a definitive answer to it because I haven't done the work. I've started to work on that, since writing the book. But as I said, in the case of Islam, I mean, there's, an enormously fascinating body of work still to be investigated that touches on many of these things, I've also, as I said a moment ago, I've begun to explore a little bit in Chinese cosmology, for example, which is very, very different than the monotheistic religions. And so where this is leading me is that, let's say for the sake of argument, I'm right about anarchy and balance of power being expressions of a particular theological worldview. So let's assume that I'm right about that. Well, that raises a very interesting question about to what extent are these ideas intelligible to others who inhabit or subscribe to a completely different mental universe, right? I'm still in the very early stages of investigating those questions. So at this point, I've got questions, but I don't have many answers.
Okay, well, keep me posted because that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. You are really among, I think, a very friendly crowd when you ground your thinking about IR in theology.
Here comes the killer question.
I just want to move off the main arguments in your lecture to ask you to, talking about the issue of order leads me always to think about hegemony. And because I'm rather a contemporary person, I think about sort of American hegemony in the post-World War II period. And that order was, in fact, you could argue, imposed by the United States. The United States brought into being the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, all the parts, the constituent parts that make up the order that we live in right now. So in a sense, U.S. is the creator of that order. But now that the U.S. is in relative decline, that order seems to be moving into some chaos. So there is this school of thought that, this is sort of the Waltzian school of thought that there is this hegemonic order, and having a hegemonic order is good because it's stable, it's less prone to war. But now we're moving into an unstable period, and so we'll see an increase in war. But then there's another school of thought that argues that, well, the principles and the norms and the institutions of this order are now in place, and the United States doesn't really control them anymore. They've become autonomous from U.S. control. And so we will perpetuate, this order will be perpetuated because even the Chinese, to a great degree, have bought into these institutions. and participate in these institutions. So order will go on, and we won't enter into a period of chaos. Just from your own understanding, your background in medieval political thing, how do you address that kind of contemporary debate about hegemonic stability versus sort of an unhegemonic chaos?
Oh, okay. Thanks for the question. Allow me to begin by saying that I'm doing something somewhat different in the book. And I think your question about hegemony kind of illustrates the importance of what I'm doing. So we talk about order all the time. I mean, order is one of the central ideas in international relations. But what's interesting is that as important and as central as the idea of order is, it's very rarely, if ever, theorized. In other words, this idea of what is order, right? It's more commonly the case that when we discuss order in IR, it's a matter of how is order maintained? How is it, modified? And so hegemony is one way of establishing and maintaining order. Balance of power is another. I'm taking a step before that, before you ever get to hegemony and so forth, to say, well, what are the underlying postulates of order? Kind of, again, I'm theorizing order as order, and I'm not interested in how order is maintained. Okay, so that's what I'm doing in the book, right? But then let me take a stab at where you're going, even though the book is not about that. And I think you've recently had speakers who are, I think, better positioned to answer that question than me. But my take on this about say the example of China, it's an interesting one in the sense that I've talked about these ideas, this vocabulary, rooted in Christian theology and so forth, but it's spread beyond that, right? The Chinese buy into this vocabulary in important ways. But this raises a question, though, again, one that I don't have the answer yet, and that is, are the understandings the same? And let me give you an example from my part of the world and something that I encountered in writing the chapter on Grotius in the book. Right? So Grotius worked for the Dutch East India Company. And one of the things that the Dutch East India Company did was conclude treaties or contracts with indigenous rulers in Southeast Asia, right where I live to this day. Now, the fascinating thing about this is that the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company, they had these contracts, these agreements to deliver cloves at a set place, or pepper in perpetuity, and so forth. And when indigenous rulers didn't do that, well, that was grounds to wage war, to enforce your rights. Well, that's how the Dutch interpreted those contracts or those agreements. But the indigenous rulers understood these agreements very differently. Right? Their understanding in entering into these agreements was that this was a sort of a prestige indicator, that as a local ruler, that was a way of demonstrating your importance, your relative importance as against other rulers. So the example I'm getting at here, by way of analogy, is that we might use the same words, the same vocabulary, but I think the really important question is, do we mean the same thing when those words are used? Another example, more contemporary example, is the idea of intervention. I've got a postdoc at NUS that's working with me, who's doing some really interesting work on the Bandung movement and the idea of intervention. And he's demonstrated to me conclusively, in my mind, that there is a Southern understanding of intervention and responsibility to protect. The language is all the same, but its meaning is very different than what those ideas mean in the North. So again, that's kind of where I would come down on sort of hegemony, decline, and the like. When we use this vocabulary in remaking the world, is the content the same? is the meaning the same? And I think in some respects it might be, but in other respects it might not be.
Thank you. Join me one more time. Thank you, Mr. Bain.
Thank you.